GB Energy has no employees. That's according to a Freedom of Information request submitted by The National. Asked how many people are currently employed by GB Energy, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero responded that it does not hold the information you have requested. This is because Great British Energy is currently being established. It went on, the company does not formally have employees at this stage. It comes amid uncertainty and doubts over how many jobs GB Energy will actually bring to Scotland or the rest of the UK. For example, Jurgen Meyer, former Siemens UK chief executive who was announced as GB Energy's chair, admitted last month that Keir Starmer's general election pledged to create 1,000 new energy jobs in Scotland through GB Energy could take as long as 20 years. So GB Energy, which was designed to create jobs, doesn't actually have any for its own. Now, we've covered GB Energy on this channel before many times, and we've basically explained how it's a massive scam. It's not a publicly owned energy provider, but a firm that manages private investments. Now, some may say, well, there's no employers yet because they've only been in power since July, and it's a process. It's still starting up. Well, this may cause you to think otherwise. There are also doubts over GB Energy's funding, with reports suggesting the UK's Treasury is drawing up plans to cut in June's spending review. The company had been promised £8.3 billion in taxpayer money over the 5-year Parliament, but was only given an initial £100 million in October's budget to cover the first 2 years. Ahead of the spending review, ministers are now considering whether they can afford to give GB Energy the promised £8.3 billion amid a pivot towards greater defence spending, according to the Financial Times. One option supposed being considered by the Treasury is cutting the funds previously earmarked for GB Energy to fund low-interest loans via local authorities for projects such as solar panels on roofs and shared ownership wind projects. Neither the Treasury nor the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero said that GB Energy will be guaranteed the £8.3 billion, which was a pledge in last year's general election manifesto. There's going to be a lack of employees because the possibility of GB Energy is still uncertain. Helena, a firm which is supposed to create jobs, can't get his own house in order. I mean, can you make sense of this mess for me?
Well, the first thing to say is that there's nothing inherently wrong with being a public investment firm. Getting some amount of money back in terms of how much equity that you have a stake in a private company from the state, that's more social ownership. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. Of course, as you've mentioned before, the problem is there's the lies. The lies is that it was going to be an energy company, and it isn't an energy company, it's a private equity firm. That's what it is, but it's owned by the state, right? And the other problems, of course, is that they continually break promises as well as lie about their plans. They continually break promises that they were going to be giving to the people. Originally it was 28 billion a year, then it was ramping up to 28 billion, and then it's going to get cut in half. And now it looks like it's going to get even less funding when we get to the spring statement, when they review how the state of the government finances, again, to finance energy spending. Now they said that, to finance defence spending. And they say that defence spending is going to go into the north of England, so Scotland just gets left by the wayside yet again. What a surprise, who'd have thunk it? And the issue, of course, with all of this is that the initial plans to have publicly owned energy provision they told us, well, they had to change these plans to make it, was it 25% of public investment versus 75% of private investment. They told us it was done that because the economy is just not good anymore. The state of the nation's finances aren't able to finance this. Well, of course, this is nonsense. You can change your fiscal rules. You could raise taxes. You could just run a deficit. If you think that the government is the currency issuer and that you're creating an additional supply of a utility, that would still bring prices down even if you're increasing the money supply. There are plenty of ways that you could finance this, but actually the reality of the reason why it became this public-private partnership thing where you shovel money into the private sector for equity was because some green finance guru caught Rachel Reeves's ear at Davos for the World Economic Forum. There's this gathering of billionaires and wealthy CEOs and corporations where just, you've said that they should be in this public funding. That's terrible. Don't do public funding. You should go and do this with private funding instead. And she just relented on it. So it becomes a way in which you provide all these jobs to the private sector. And so you can't guarantee jobs if your funding is coming from the private sector, because you can't guarantee the private sector is going to invest, right? All they've done is essentially, well, here's our GB Energy Quango, essentially. And then we're just going to, we're going to inshallah. And then hopefully from there, the private sector investment will just appear. If you book it, they will come. has essentially been Labour's approach with regards to GB Energy. And the one good thing, I mean, I'm not critical of Labour just because I hate them kind of axiomatically, right? I say when they do good things and I say when they do bad things. One of the really good things in the GB Energy plan, which was put forward by Ed Miliband, was the local power plan, which we're talking about there with regards to increased funding for local energy projects would be community owned. It would take people money off people's council tax, right? This would be politically useful and would be social ownership, actual, sewer socialism from the ground up. And if that gets cut, essentially all that's left is just a private equity firm that's doling out money to other private sector corporations. You can't guarantee those jobs will be in Scotland because we'll be where the private sector wants to invest rather than where the public sector thinks that it is best to be able to create community jobs. And the jobs at the actual headquarters based in Scotland, first of all, they might have funding stripped away, and there's going to be office jobs at the end of the day managing these funds. So unless they actually get a broad industrial strategy, unless they actually understand what it is they want to do in regards to them becoming a clean energy superpower, which seems like it's going to be donkey's years away. Even Jürgen Meyer says as such, 20 years away? We don't have time to wait this long for the investment to come. China already beating half the world in terms of green investment, in terms of green technology companies being able to produce these things. If we don't get on the bike right now to get these things built, we won't have the jobs, we won't have the energy, and we won't get this promise of lower bills, which is what the government told us they would do before the election. So it's just litany of broken promises off of the back of changed mandates and a lot of hoodwinking of the public into what the reality of this would be. Even if what it ends up with isn't necessarily terrible, it's all based off of a pack of lies. And that is what the public, and especially the people of Scotland, are going to be angry with.
Yeah, because I don't think the majority of people are going to know the ins and outs of the policy detail of GB Energy. And you're absolutely right. I agree with you that a management firm of investments of both public and private for renewable energy isn't a bad policy. It's a step in the right direction. Of course, it's not a macro policy. It's not a bold move. It's actually sticking plaster politics, but it's not anything bad. But you're right. They knew what they were doing when they marketed this. It was GB Energy, Great British Energy, and people, not just ordinary voters, but Labour members were saying, "Oh, this is public ownership. This is public ownership of energy." Obviously, it wasn't, and I think they've deliberately made it vague enough that it was never going to be that. Of course, vague enough that someone like Ed Miliband thought, well, actually, I can, because I think Ed Miliband's, whatever his political nous is, whatever he was like as a leader, his political instincts is obviously far better than those of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. He looked at that and thought, maybe we can do some really good fundamental policy changes. But that's naive, isn't it? Because the reason why GB Energy was so vague is because ultimately it was just going to be a vehicle for private investment. And actually, in a way, I quite like that you kind of called it a quango, because in a way it kind of is, because they've gone down to 25% public investment, which is basically kind of got rid of the entire premise of it before. It's just leaving it up to the market now. And if Rachel Reeves could just go to Davos and completely change her mind because, I don't know, she was smooth talked by some multimillionaire, it is kind of like another quango, isn't it? And that's what this government has been about. It's been about saying about changing things, but not actually doing anything about it. And what's the end result? Even if it's about lowering bills, which is, I thought, their priority, because a lot of people on the Labour right will say the left are purist, it's a middle class movement, they're so wedded to nationalisation, we don't care if it's public or private, as long as we start making retail offers for ordinary people, such as reducing bills. And they can't even do that, can they? Because inherently in this system of private involvement, you can't have reduced bills, can you?
Well, exactly, because the reason why bills are going up right now is because of marginal cost pricing, which the government could click their fingers and change instantly. We're at this ridiculous point where wind farms are being paid by the government to be turned off because they don't want to sell energy at a lower price because we've not hit the point where we start using gas because of higher demand, which is the marginal price much higher, which is much more profitable for the renewable energy companies, right? We have an insane system which private involvement drives the interest in profit rather than the interest in what is best for the community at large by keeping bills low. Of course, we have a privatized grid as well, which is insane to think of. People say, well, they've got this plan to reconnect Britain, which is fine in the abstract. But the reason why you need this plan is essentially subsidizing the fact that the private national grid company hasn't done grid upgrades. It's barely upgraded the grid since it was privatized fucking 30 odd years ago, which is why we're in this absolute mess with regards to connectivity for new energy projects, which takes years and years and years. So, and the idea of nationalising the grid is hardly like leftist in terms of policy. This was proposed by Neil Kinnock in the '92 Labour manifesto. This isn't radical to claim that we should be nationalising our grid and then having 100% public investment in energy projects, so we are the ones who control what the end price is for the consumer to actually bring bills down, rather than just trying to maximise supply and hope that the private sector won't cartelise to maximise their profits over the public interest. Because this is harming consumers as well as people in the retail. It's also harming businesses too. Obviously, I'm a socialist. I think they should be collectively owned. But even if you're a liberal, even if you're a liberal capitalist, you'll look at our system of energy where private profit is being prioritized over broader social utility, and local small businesses cannot get off the ground because their energy costs are super, super high. Their rental costs are incredibly high as well, because all of our rental properties for commercial lets are all owned by, multi-billionaires or Russian oligarchs who have cornered the market in charging people through the nose. How is any small cooperative or traditional business supposed to survive in a world where our energy costs per megawatt hour are double the cost of Finland's, for example? Like, this is completely untenable, and the root comes from the fact that the people who control our energy system have no interest in the broader health of our economy. All they care about is lining the inside of their own pockets. And the reason why we're at the point where we can't have a properly new nationalized energy system, or even new publicly owned energy to compete in a privatized system, and it all has to come down to Rachel Reeves and her fiscal rules. It all has to come down to her inability to look at public investment solely as something that's important to do regardless of those fiscal rules. Or indeed, if you wanted to hit the fiscal rules looking at taxing the rich, which Rachel Reeves also will not do. Ed Miliband, God bless him, I don't like his politics broadly, but his heart is in the right place on this issue. And all of his baby that he created with 5 years, he was the only person actually crafting policy, whilst the people in the Sweeney Politburo were busy trying to infight against the left. He's actually done work in putting together a policy proposal for green energy, and it's been completely curtailed by Rachel Reeves' total insistence upon continuing neoliberal doctrine in terms of macroeconomics in this country.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.